The Boxer Rebellion was an uprising by the Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fists, who were nicknamed Boxers as their martial arts was known as Chinese boxing. Basically, these boxers were mad at all of the foreign influence in China and had decided to beat up, attack, and kill any Western, diplomat, missionary, or Chinese Christian that they came across. Anyway, they laid siege to Peking, where everyone had taken refuge to be protected by a small force of international troops. Of course, the great powers saw this and went, "Oh crap, we're going to send forces into China to relieve the siege and end the entire Boxer Rebellion." Also, the Qing dynasty sent forces to support the Boxers against the great powers, and war could have escalated in China, but the Qing dynasty switched sides in summer of 1900 as southern Chinese governors refused the Empress's decree of war against the great powers. Additionally, Qing General Rongluo, who was the supreme commander of the Chinese military forces, was against supporting the Boxers and claimed that in some instances he acted to protect the foreigners in the face of Qing and Boxer attacks. The Boxers would be defeated and a large war between the great powers and the Qing dynasty was avoided. In this alternate timeline, what if the Qing dynasty escalated the Boxer Rebellion and the great powers fought a prolonged war in China in 1900? Changes that can be made to escalate the Boxer Rebellion would be to have either the southern governors agree to go to war with the great powers, or if Rongluo was either in favor of war and the Boxers, or if he was not the supreme commander of the Qing dynasty's military. Each case here would create 3 different scenarios, but for the purposes of this video, we'll have Rongluo agree to war as he was close to the Empress, and the southern governors had many grievances with the Qing dynasty, and even more grievances with the Qing than they had with the foreigners. But before I get into this scenario, I think it might be a good idea to look at what everyone wants from China. The British want Tibet to become an area of British influence as Britain and Russia were heavily engaged in a power competition which is known as the Great Game. The US kind of wanted to stay out of the war as much as possible as America had minimal interests in China. France wants to expand their concessions, and it is also in competition with the British, as in the south, Thailand had remained a sovereign state to split up British Burma and French Indochina. Germany is game to gain as much territory as possible as Germany had been late to the colonial game and wanted its navy to eventually compete with the British Navy. Italy and Austria-Hungary were kind of just there as minor allied powers, wanting some increases in influence and territory, but they don't really send as many troops as the rest of the powers. Meanwhile, Japan and Russia sent the most forces as they had the most interest in taking as much Chinese land as they could get. After the siege of Peking, the 8-nation alliance of the US, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, Russia, and Austria-Hungary remains in China to fight the Qing dynasty throughout the early 1900s in what I'm going to call the Qing War for simplicity. The early course of the war sees Allied forces engage more heavily armed Qing troops than they had previously fought before, but the Allied troops are still better equipped and better trained. The southern provinces defect from the Qing dynasty in the face of increased foreign troop presence in the north. The Qing dynasty starts to fracture, but it's not completely falling apart yet. Alfred von Waldersee was a German military officer in charge of the Allied occupation of Peking in our timeline after the siege, so it seems like a reasonable assumption to make him the supreme Allied commander of the 8-nation alliance forces in China against the Qing. The supreme Allied commander von Waldersee discourages widespread looting, which I don't think would be able to be enforced, but what is enforced is a code of conduct against war crimes as the Qing War becomes more and more prolonged. However, he would die in 1904. Von Waldersee's successor could be French General Henri Nicolas Frey, as he was an experienced French officer in leading the French Marines, American General Adna Chaffee, as he was a very experienced American general, and America did not have a prominent place in the Qing War, so there's less politics with an American Supreme Commander, or it could be someone entirely different who rises to increased prominence in the early years of the Qing War. But due to political ambitions and competing interests, I don't think that a Russian or Japanese general is named as Supreme Allied Commander. Also, it would not be Austro-Hungarian or Italian, as both empires contributed less than a lot of the others. Meanwhile, the 1911 revolution in China occurs around the summer of 1905 in this alternate timeline. Russia and Japan have not had the 1904 Russo-Japanese War in this timeline and still have their territorial claims against one another in China as the Boxer Rebellion becomes the Qing War. The grievances that each have against one another are only further exacerbated by the Qing War as Japanese and Russian high commands have their armies cut off the opposing forces to claim more territory. Although they are allied in the Qing War, Russia and Japan are not friends. It's kind of like the US and USSR in 1946 or 1947. They're sort of friends, but not really. Further tensions and overlap between claims by the Allied powers in China increases as the war goes on. Some tensions and claims can be calmed, such as that between the British and French, as Britain sends more troops than the French do into China. But others, like Japan and Russia or British and Russian competition, heightens. President Theodore Roosevelt would definitely take a role in trying to mediate the interests of these powers during his term as the president. World War I probably still happens with increased tensions from China and with the July crisis after the definitely likely assassination of Franz Ferdinand, assuming of course that Austro-Hungarian involvement in the Qing War did not affect his actions and trip to Sarajevo. And of course I'm assuming that the Austro-Hungarian involvement in the war does not affect the life of Gavrilo Princip and the goals of the Black Hand against the Austro-Hungarian Empire, as well as the lives of everyone who was in Sarajevo at the time in our 1914. So the question becomes, will Russia back Serbia against their ally Austria-Hungary? If so, how would this affect the various alliances and secret agreements of the 8 powers that are currently fighting in China? And what happens to all of the troops that are still fighting in the Qing War, as that war might be overshadowed by this upcoming Great War? The Great War would definitely still happen in this alternate timeline, but it would be a different World War I with the Qing War in play. For this scenario, I'm going to go with Russia doesn't have Serbia's back, and Austria-Hungary conducts their poorly planned invasion in 1914, which humiliates the empire as everyone laughs at the Austro-Hungarians. Russia supports Serbia but won't go to war. The alliance in the Qing War is further fractured as Austria-Hungary will later pull out to fight in Serbia. Regarding the start of World War I, and if it comes around the same time, it's unknown how it would end up after already having 14 years of war in China between the great powers and with troops in country. But I feel like secret agreements may not fully be upheld as states like Russia and Japan go to war, and it's possible that Britain might also go to war with Russia due to the Great Game being very different as a result of the Qing War. Remember, World War I in this alternate timeline is not starting with Sarajevo, so the Entente and Central Powers are not fully set in stone, with over 14 years of alternate fighting in China, so different alliances may have been made or broken. However, it's also possible that with the idiocy of multipolar world politics that everyone just goes to war with one another like they did in our timeline without considering the consequences of how things are going in China, and China just becomes another massive battlefield where millions more die. One thing is for sure though, there is definitely an earlier Chinese warlord era, and the great powers would probably be using warlords as proxies against one another in the multipolar world. Regardless of World War I starting during the Qing War, China is a mess of fighting between the powers. The Qing are gone by the end of the Qing War, and the main reason that the war lasts as long as it does is warlord states being allied or against the great powers, as well as who those warlords are allied with and against of the great powers, because some warlords may like Russia or may hate Britain or vice versa and all that stuff. Turf wars within China would likely break out between powers such as Russia and Japan over territory like Manchuria and other disputed land after the Qing are defeated. And assuming World War I already happened after this, or if World War I had not taken place due to the 20 years of fighting in China, then one of these turf wars could very well be the start of the Great War after peace in China had been achieved and the former alliance is divided between itself. How this alliance is divided and who would be on whose side is beyond the scope of this video. But that, of course, is just one possible scenario for if the Boxer Rebellion erupted into a full-scale war. What do you think would have happened had the Boxer Rebellion become the Qing War? Write in the comments, and thank you for watching. Also, in this alternate timeline, there's no Russian Revolution, so suck it, commies!